it took many visits to a doctor to find out that I did not have a brain tumor. It took reassurances from a very well-known psychiatrist friend who said, "I can certify that you're sane, Bob." I said, "Well, what's the matter with me? And what's this thing that's happening to me?" And he said, "Well, I think that you are doing what is known as conscious dreaming." And I looked at him and I said, "What's conscious dreaming?" He says, "I don't know, I just made it up." And I said, thank you. And I then got together with my psychologist friend and I said, "Brad, what do I do about this thing?" He says, "Oh, that's easy." I says, "What?" He says, "They do it in India all the time. They know all about it in India." And I said, "Well, what should I do then?" He says, "Well, I would think you should go to India and study under a guru and live in an ashram until you know all about it." And I said, "Well, how long would that take?" And he said, "Oh, probably 10 or 20 years." I said, 10 or 20 years? What about my business? What about my mortgaged house? What about my wife and my 2 children? He says, "Oh, this is important." And I looked at him very in the face and I said, "Brad, if this were you, what would you do?" And he looked at me with his eyes. He says, "Robert," he says, "it's not happening to me, it's happening to you." And he waved goodbye. So that was the response of that beginning. And being of a stubborn variety and knowing that I did not have a brain tumor, knowing that physically I was all right, and the 2 people that I trusted most in the mental health field knew me so well that they said, "Oh, you have no mental problem. What does one do?" So the natural response that I had in my way of thinking, being a Western mind, I couldn't see going to India and spending 10 years living in an ashram. That would not be very comfortable for me. And also, that's not the way I think. I'm a Western mind. So being very stubborn, what I did is to turn around and establish a research and development division in my company, taking the one that we had and moved it over in this other direction to find out what's happening to me, or find out something, so that I in turn could have some answers for me. So it was a very selfish motivation, and in the beginning it was nothing noble or wanting to help the world or humankind, not that at all. I needed the help. I had a company that could spend R&D funds to do this, and that's how it began. And a footnote, bear in mind that it took a full year after this first took place for me to finally come to the conclusion that this was real, that it was not a dream, that it was not an hallucination, that it actually took place. Because my left brain, my intellect, my analytical part of me had to be knowing this, not believing it. And it took not a great adventure or a great something that took place. It was an accumulation of one verification after another, again and again and again. And after a while I said, myself, my brain, my left brain, my total self had to say, yes, this is real. There's too much evidence. Never mind the world, but for me. Mm-hmm. And that's how it began.
Bob, after you began this this investigation into your own experiences, out of your own need to understand what was happening, out of that came HemiSync. Could you tell us how the information about the influence of these sound patterns with the kind of experience that you were researching, how did that connection get made for you?
Well, again, first and foremost, I was the prime subject. That we're going all the way back to when I was in New York and had offices in New York and had a house in Westchester County. And I secretly put a laboratory on our property in Westchester because New York somehow felt too noisy, so we had this R&D program and built into a 25-acre place up in Westchester County. It started very simply. We already knew how to put people to sleep. So then it began to say, well, what is this and how are we doing this? And we had started with a very sound scientific base of using sine waves that replicated the brain waves in the human mind, the human brain, to in turn induce this sleep. Well, it didn't take much more pattern searching to determine that if we adjusted those into areas that we had not looked at before, we would begin to find something else. And sure enough, we did. And it was all the way back there in 1960 that we first began to use what we have called in recent years frequency following response. And that's where that's different from hemisync. It's different from a binaural beat type. This you can hear in open air. It doesn't require headphones to have maximum ability to listen to it. And we used that very, very broadly for a number of years. In terms of the hemisync process itself, the hemisync process didn't really take place until the 70s, and by that time we had moved over to Charlottesville, Virginia, and gotten into cable television, and that was the new thing to do as against radio stations. And we had, through an association with by that time I had accumulated about 8 or 9 different engineers and scientists and doctors in Virginia. And we, as a group, it was nothing, again, mystical or magical, we decided that would be the good way to do it, to create a binaural beat. And that's how hemisync was born. Mm-hmm. And that is, you know how it works, I'm sure. That's by setting one kind of signal, say a 100 hertz signal in this ear, and then 104 hertz over here. And the differential, that 4 hertz, is synthesized by the mind, the brain. You can't hear it, it's too low in frequency to hear. But it is very effective to get that 4 hertz, which is a brainwave frequency, into the human mind.